Hi everybody, so this is my second video on tone and value. If you haven't watched the first one, I would suggest watching that first because that's more of an intro and this is more of a follow-up. So I'm going to do more of a deep dive into seeing tone, like how do we identify tones, how do we simplify them, how do we make artistic decisions about them. Also going to look at using toned paper. So again, this is just a different way of seeing things. We're probably used to working on white paper or cream paper, so that is our natural lightest tone, whereas on toned paper you have to think much more intentionally about your highlights and putting a lighter tone in. So that's a great exercise. And I had some brilliant questions after my last video, so I'm going to address those questions as well. But I've really been thinking about tone and what it is and what it encapsulates. As I was working on the last video and just planning and preparing for this month, I've realised that tone just is so many things. And I think it's often forgotten about, or one of the last things we think about when we're learning to draw and paint. I think we focus on line work first. You know, we learn to sketch. We might start with stickmen and then we think about adding colour. You know, we've got our line works, we start to fill it in and put the colour in, and it can take a while to get confident with colour, mixing colour, choosing colours, putting different colours together. And I think sometimes then we don't go beyond that to the next step, which is tone. And I feel like tone is often the last step on this kind of drawing and painting journey. And maybe it's not something that you're necessarily interested in or drawn to, but I really do think learning a bit about tone will take your artwork to the next level for anybody. Just bringing in more tonal contrast and just learning how to use tone in a considered way will take things to the next level. Because tone is so many things and it's so much more than just shadows. I think if I say tone and value, you think of, you know, shadows, which gives us a sense of where the light's coming from. It also gives us a sense that this box is 3D and it's sitting on the floor. I don't need to draw the floor in because the shadow tells us that the box isn't floating, so it gives it weight, light and shadow, a sense of it being 3D. But tone is so much more than just that. It's also atmosphere. So tonal images lend themselves really well to being moody and atmospheric, or quite sad or quite scary. If you want to create a really scary image or a really sad image, tone is a great way to do that, but it doesn't have to be. Tonal images can also be nostalgic, peaceful, reflective, joyful, anything really, but tone is great for creating atmosphere. Tone is also great for creating depth and perspective. We can use tone to bring things into the foreground or push them into the distance. You know, if you're thinking maybe you're painting a mountain range, the mountains, as they get further and further away, they're getting lighter. We can also use tone to direct your eye, the eye of the viewer. So you can say, look at this. You can create narrative. It's also a big part of negative space, which I love using in my work. You cannot have negative space without having the contrast of two different tones. It's a big part of patterns, which I love playing with pattern and tone. So stripes, obviously, but also florals, checks, polka dots, that kind of thing. Tone is also really important in creating texture, which I love. It can also inform your colour choices. It can make choosing colours easier, which I'll come on to in a minute. So tone is so many things. It's so much more than just putting a shadow in. So yeah, it's such a great subject to kind of really dig into, because it will have an effect on your work. It'll start to inform your work, and exploring tone more has been really, really good for me as an artist and really helped me make kind of more engaging images. So a question I had was about shadows and would I just use black for shadows? I don't really anymore, and I find it's very easy when you're painting shadows with black and some water or black and white for them to feel unnatural and heavy. And the thing with shadows is in most cases the shadow is not the subject of the painting, so you don't want it to distract. But I found when I was teaching quite often, people would put a shadow in, and then once it dried they would say, oh, I really don't like it, the shadow is way too dark, it's really distracting. So yeah, I feel like it's easy to get shadows wrong if you're painting them with a grey that's made of black. They can be quite heavy and overwhelming. So the question asked about using black, and the question also asked, should shadows be light or dark? Now, whether shadows should be light or dark completely depends on your reference painting, your reference image, or just what you're looking at when you're painting, what your subject matter is. So generally speaking, on a really bright sunny day, the shadows are going to be darker because you're going to have that really strong contrast of light and dark. And on a really cloudy, overcast day, which is what I have today, your shadows are going to be much, much subtler. So whether the shadow should be light or dark really depends on your lighting conditions, what you're painting, and what you want the focus of the image to be. But as a general rule of thumb, I would start lighter because it's much easier to make your shadows darker than to make them lighter. So the way I paint shadows is I use my chromatic grey mix, which I'll show you in a minute, and I water it down so it is translucent, and then I can just add it as a layer. So in this image, I really wanted to capture shadows. I really wanted to practice them and get better, and this was a really, really bright summer's day, and my son was picking apples in our apple tree, so the sun was shining through the leaves, and then he was getting all the shadows of the leaves on him, and it was a bright sunny day, so I really wanted to capture that. So I painted him first in gouache, and then I put the shadows over the top using this transparent shadow colour, and then I put the details of the shirt over the top. So generally I would paint the subject first, then layer the shadows over the top wherever I want them, unless the material happens to be water soluble, in which case I would put that on last. So Neocolors and watercolour pencils are both water soluble, so if I put the stripes on first and then put the shadows on, it would all bleed. So just thinking about the timing and the layering there. But what I haven't done is mixed up a kind of a shadow skin colour and a shadow trousers colour and a shadow hair colour, shadow, t-shirt colour. I've just mixed up one shadow colour and layered it, which for me just makes it easier. And the thing about thinking about the property of shadows, they are transparent, they're a veil, they are ephemeral. You don't want shadows to feel really solid and heavy because that's just not what they're like. So I find working with this kind of transparent layering works well. And I really like this chromatic grey colour because for me it feels more natural. Generally you always want shadows to be quite cool. You don't, so I really like this colour because you get this kind of pooling of the blue, which again just feels right for shadows. So in this image I've used some thicker gouache. This is quite opaque gouache and it feels more solid, and then the shadows are very watered down, so they are transparent, and it just makes them feel light and transparent and ephemeral as opposed to this actual solid fruit and boxes and that kind of thing. But I love the blue pooling because that just feels right for shadows. And shadows can be so useful for just giving a sense of objects. With a plate you don't even need to draw the plate, you can just put the shadow around the outside, for example. So yeah, I really like that colour mix for putting shadows in. Like I've got another example that I wanted to show you. Oh yeah, here. So shadows were really important in this image. It was a really bright sunny day and the shadows of the trees and the people were sort of on the building. So I painted this first and then put the shadows in over the top with this transparent mix to try and get the feeling of the shadows move across the buildings and it being a bright sunny day, rather than mixing a separate shadow colour for the wood, a shadow colour for the walls, a shadow colour for this and that. For me it's just quicker to use one transparent mix and layer it over. So that's what I've done here. I used to do shadows kind of with a sort of a cool brown pencil like sepia or Van Dyke Brown and just kind of scribble underneath, but I tend to do them more liquid now. Just trying to see if I've got another. Yeah, so I used to do my shadows more like that, but I kind of like the feeling of them being more transparent now. It's another one that I'm looking for. Yeah, so with this one I would have painted that little shadow there first and then put the lines over the top, because these lines are Neocolor and they are water soluble. And with this one the shadow is so subtle, but it's just there and it just gives it that little 3D-ness. So yeah, my top tips for painting shadows are: keep the shadow light, keep it transparent, keep it really loose. With these, obviously I had defined shadows of the leaves, but generally if you're painting the shadow of something really complicated, I would just keep it kind of loose and rounded. You can get very caught up in painting complicated shadows, and I always want to just capture the impression. So, you know, with this I've just kept it quite loose and blobby to try and capture the impression of the shadow without getting caught up in trying to get every single leaf in the right place. So keep them loose, keep them light, keep them transparent, and keep them cool in tone. I've seen people do shadows that are very purpley or blue, and that works really well, especially if it's shadows on like a white building on a really sunny day with a blue sky. The shadows are going to look really blue, so that works well as well. And I'm just going to show you that colour mix. If you have been on my Patreon for a while, you've probably seen me do this colour mix before, but I'm going to use it in a minute, so I'll mix it now. So after a bit of playing around, this is my go-to colour mix for shadows and for tonal paintings and all sorts. So I've got Flame Red, which is a sort of a yellowy red. It's got sort of orangey yellow undertones. We've got Permanent Yellow Deep, which is quite a dark, rich yellow, very warm. And then we've got Ultramarine, which has red undertones. I'm just putting a tiny bit more of the Ultramarine. And then I just mix those together with plenty of water. And then I can just adjust. I think I've got slightly too much yellow in, so then I just need a little bit more of the blue. And it really depends what end colour I'm going for. If I was going for sepia, that would be fine, but as I want it to be more of a shadowy colour, I'm going to put a little bit more blue in. Sometimes people have a go making this mix and they struggle with it a bit. I would say, if you can, use the exact colours that I'm using. And just adjust it. You know, if it comes out a bit yellowy, add some more blue. If it, you know, if it comes out too blue, add more red and yellow, just adjust it. So I'm happy with that now. And if you watched the previous video, you've probably seen me do a demonstration with this colour, but I'm just going to grab it. So when it's like this, it looks like a dark grey, but when we add lots of water and it dries, the pigments kind of separate out a little bit. So this is an example of just black watercolour, so you can see how the shadow with using black would look, and then this is this sepia mix, this chromatic grey, and you can see how the blue separates out, which I really like. I think it's really nice, and I think that's more of a kind of a natural soft shadow colour to me personally, rather than the black, which feels a little bit heavier. So I really like this colour for shadows. It feels quite natural and neutral, but then it's also got the cool tones as well. So that is what I use for shadows. Okay, so we are going to look at seeing tones and making artistic decisions about tones. So my number one top tip for seeing tones is to squint or close one eye. I don't know why, but it really kind of polarizes everything. It brings everything into contrast and it flattens everything, and it's a great way of seeing what's really there, not what you think is there. So as I'm looking at this image of my son walking in a forest, you know, I'm kind of thinking, boy, tree, stripes, jumper. If I squint, I can suddenly see that there's more light on the left hand side and there's more shadow on his right side. I can just suddenly see that much more clearly once I'm squinting. So yeah, that is my number one tip for seeing the tones, is to close one eye or to squint. But we can also make artistic decisions about those tones. So I'm going to show you how I would sketch this piece. So I chose this because we've got very clear tones. We've got the dark tones, which is the stripes, his sandals, the trees and his hair. We've also got the mid-tones of the grass and his trousers, and we've got the lighter tones, the white stripes, and we've got the sky as well. And there is actually quite a bit of shadow on him on one side, so I'm going to put that in as well. And yeah, just doing that, kind of taking a step back and just closing one eye, squinting, and just giving yourself to have a look, a chance to say, okay, where are there actually shadows, where are there actually highlights? Like doing that, I've now spotted areas of grass that have more shadows, so it's a really, really good practice, because working tonally is all about getting away from just drawing what you think is there. It's all about drawing, seeing what's actually there. It's really, really great for that. So just very loosely sketching. I'm not going to focus on them too much, but I do feel like the perspective on the hands is hard. Okay, so I've got him, and then I've got the tree. I probably should have put him lower down, but never mind. I've naturally plonked him right in the centre because he's the subject. Never mind. We've got trees. And I'm looking now, there should be, I brought the trees right down to here where the log is. I really should have made him lower because the log's right at the bottom, so I need to bring the trees up a bit. I've done that kind of classic thing where you focus on something and make it the subject, and then it gets bigger because you're paying attention to it. But anyway, so I want to have a bit of that kind of path coming down behind him. And then looking at we've got the trees are going to be the dark tone, and then our mid tone is going to be the leaves, and then our light tone is the sky. His trousers are mid-tone, but then within the tone of his trousers there'll be shadows on them, because we have the tone of his trousers. His trousers are sage green, that's kind of a mid-tone, it's not really dark, it's not really light, but then within that sage green there is areas where the sun's hitting them where they're lighter, and then there's areas where they're in shadow, so they're appearing darker. And the same with his jumper, you know, there's dark areas where the blue stripes are, there's light areas where the white stripes are, but there's also dark areas where it's in shadow, and there's lighter areas where it's in the sun, so we've got that kind of combination of the colours of objects, but also the way shadows interact with them. And I can remember when I think I was about 15 or 16, and I was painting a lily, like an orange lily, and my teacher kept telling me, you need more tonal contrast, and I was going, but look, I'm mixing up all these different oranges, I'm doing contrast, I'm doing it. And she was going, no you aren't, you're creating lots of different colour because there's variation of colour on the lily, but you're not actually creating tonal contrast, you're not creating depth. You need to look at the shadows, don't look at the colour of the lily, look at where the shadows are and the depth and the highlights. And at the time I was not getting it, and now I completely get it, and she was 100% right, because in my brain I was just thinking, I am painting an orange lily, the petals are orange, it must all be orange. But what I actually needed to do was probably look at the lily and squint a bit and go, oh actually there's a highlight on the petal, oh there's a shadow there where the stamen is, there's a shadow where the petals all go down into the centre, and actually put the tones on. And using the method of putting the shadows on in a transparent wash probably would have really helped me, because what I was struggling to do was to separate the colour that the lily actually was, and then the colour it was in different light conditions, the colour it was in shadow, the colour it was with highlights, where the sun was hitting it. So if I'd painted the lily and maybe then put the shadows on with a transparent wash, that probably would have helped me put the depth in. I can't remember how the painting turned out, but I do remember very clearly the teacher kind of telling me that I wasn't seeing the depth, I wasn't seeing the tonal values, I was just painting what I thought was there, and that was a very valuable lesson. Though at the time I think I just wanted her to tell me that I was doing great, but it was a very, very valuable lesson. Okay, so I've got rough sketch. So in terms of building a tonal image, I often start with the lighter tones first. So I'm going to do a little bit of a squint, because immediately I can tuck that arm in behind his body because it's got a shadow there, the light's coming this way, so I'm going to put shadow in on this side of his jumper and kind of right across the arm. My mum's arm. And then I'm going to paint some of the So I don't want his face to be the same tonal value as the background, because he's literally just going to blend into the background, and then I'd have to put an outline around his head to make him separate from the background. So I'm going to make the artistic decision to make his face a little bit lighter and not put his face in full shadow, because I want him to be the subject, and I know that even though he's in shadow, I know he's got pale skin, which is lighter than the trees around him. So in cases like that, it's kind of doing the squinting or closing one eye, looking at what's actually there tonally. You know, you can switch your photo to black and white to have a look at it. And then if the tones aren't quite working with the story you want to tell, the focus you want the image to have, it's just making an artistic decision, making kind of an informed artistic decision to say, right, that's not quite working in the image, so I'm going to change it slightly. So yeah, I'm going to put in some of that tone around him, which then kind of uses the negative space and sort of sculpts his little nose and his cheek. I'm starting to put some of this in as well, the tree, and then coming down here we've got some darker bit of the grass there, putting that in. And the grass isn't all in shadow, there's just sort of areas of shadow, so I'm just kind of putting that in where that's kind of occurring, and just putting in some individual blades of grass as well. So we've got some lighter tones, and looking at where he's standing, it's going to have some shadow behind him, but the shadows are quite soft and diffused. And the log's actually lighter than the grass behind him, so I'll put some shadow in behind. So it's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, fitting everything together. And then his trousers are fairly dark, so they're not the darkest tone, but there's a fair amount of kind of tonal contrast there. And then putting in a little bit more shadow and using wet on wet, which kind of softens it. And then looking at where the stripes are. So everything's very kind of soft at the moment, so that's going to bring in some contrast. Using the stripes to tell us where his jumper is, where it ends, but also how his arms are moving. The stripes are kind of helping us deal with that foreshortening of the arm coming towards us and the direction of his body, so kind of looking at where the stripes actually are and then layering them over that shadow that's already there. I've miscounted, I think I've run out of space for the last stripe, but that's fine. I don't want to squeeze it in. I think you get the picture. And then I think I'm going to put some of the trees in. I'm kind of also thinking about what I'm working on when, so I don't smudge anything. So I also want to paint his feet and his hair, but I don't want to put my hand in any of this wet paint. And I'm holding this brush really upright, A, because I don't want to put my hand in wet paint, and B, because it's going to make the trees feel more natural and not too perfect, which I like. And there's a bit of a tree branch, kind of tree coming behind here, so I'm going to make that a bit lighter because then it feels like it's more in the distance. Again, holding it very upright to get these thin lines that also feel quite natural. I've had people ask me quite a lot about painting trees, and for me, my problem for years with painting trees was making them look too perfect, kind of painting what I thought a tree looked like. So having the brush really upright like this can really help have more natural kind of wobbly tree branches. I'm using a size 4, which is fairly large. I could use a smaller brush for some of the really little tree branches, but just using this one for now. So there's kind of a long skinny one kind of here. And there's a darker one that's kind of coming behind their hands. I never get things completely accurate in a painting. You know, this tree should actually be behind their hands, but I'm not too much of a slave to accuracy. You'll probably have noticed in my paintings. It's more about it kind of feeling accurate, feeling right, rather than being 100% sort of photo perfect. So even the trees are the dark tones, but then within the trees there are darker ones and lighter ones. I'm going to bring a smaller brush in now for some details. Kind of more trees in the distance, so they're kind of skinnier because they're in the distance, but they're also going to be lighter as well. So using that lighter tone for the trees then kind of gives us a sense of depth and perspective. I'm going to do my son's feet. He's wearing dark socks and dark sandals, which I'm just going to simplify. And then using that kind of darkest tone very sparingly. I want to do his eye, but I think if I put my hand there it's going to go in wet paint, so I'll just wait a second. You can also pop a bit of shadow under there. And then he's got very dark hair. And I could put some darker tones and kind of contrast on the trees if I wanted. don't know, am I going to regret that? Just a little bit. Right, I'm going to pause for 1 second while this dries a bit more. Okay, that's all dry now, so I can put in final details. So this is our line work and our very darkest tones, what I'm putting in last, just kind of where they're needed. By the way, random thing that I do, if I've just washed my brush or dipped it in water, I take off any excess water on the ferrules or the metal bit, just run my finger over it like that, because if there's a little bit of water on here and I'm doing very fine details, it could just slip around in my hands or it could smudge. So I just do that to make sure I've got kind of maximum control of the brush. So if I sound out of breath, I went into the house and just kind of ran up to my studio again. Right, what to do first? I think so we've got a little eyelash on that side, and then eye here, and could bring his fringe fork down a little bit more because it's kind of almost, you can see his eyebrow there, but it's it's quite long. Just put his little ear in. And then hands, so complicated. Just kind of putting in his little hands on my mum's hand. And then just looking at kind of where more tones needed for definition. So putting in a bit kind of behind him there. have put his face in shadow a little bit in the end because it just makes more sense, but I think with the kind of tones behind him, I think he still feels like the focus, he hasn't disappeared into the background too much. Okay, I'm going to stop there, but hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of how I would approach an image tonally and kind of break it down, simplify the tones, make artistic decisions about the tones and build it up layer by layer. So I just thought I would do a quick demonstration of how you can use a tonal sketch to help you simplify a scene. So this can be really useful if you are sketching from life and you've got a busy scene in front of you and you kind of want to simplify it and also get the essential details down quickly, and then you can go back in and add the details but you don't get too kind of lost in it. Or if you're just working from a complicated reference image and you don't know where to start, kind of simplifying it and looking for the tones can be a great way in, if that makes sense. So I found this photo. I thought this was a nice example because we've kind of got this darker foreground. The image is kind of framed by the trees around the outside, and then the buildings, which are lovely, are kind of lighter and they're slightly in the distance. Then we've got the statue in the foreground, so lots of tones going on. The photographer's obviously done a kind of an arty thing where they've got some motion blur of a car going by. I'm going to completely ignore that, obviously. But yeah, but apart from that, I liked this photo and it kind of suited my purposes, so we're going to carry on with this one. So I'm just going to sketch kind of really quickly and loosely. So we've got some buildings, head of the statue, kind of back here. Statue, tree behind, tree. And I'm just going to go in kind of super loose and just put some tones in first with a kind of rough sketch. Might even go for a bigger brush maybe, just to help me kind of keep this loose. And then looking at where the shadows are and kind of putting in some mid-tones. We've got shadows on the steps. Some kind of lighter trees here. And then very light for these buildings in the background. Just putting in this little lamppost, which is very sweet. It's quite tall actually. Just putting in a few more details. So obviously this is a very quick kind of rough and ready sketch, but you can see that I've got a lot of detail down very quickly, and it's kind of helped me capture the mood of this kind of sunny day, this kind of sunny square in the sunlight, and then we've got these trees in the foreground that's slightly in the shadow and it's framing it. And then from this kind of rough tonal study I could then bring it into colour. But I would be much more aware of the tonal values and much more intentional of choosing, you know, darker greens, keeping these colours very soft and very light so that I maintain this kind of mood. The lighting and the framing, so that gets carried on into the artwork because I've done this kind of rough tonal sketch first. So in our next exercise we are going to use toned paper. So I haven't actually done this a huge amount, and then I did it when I was doing a live, taking part in a live Zoom call that Sarah Dyer was hosting, which was an alphabet of animals, and it worked out we had something like 3 minutes per animal, and because it was alphabet themed I thought, I've got these alphabet filing cards that I bought absolutely years ago. I was still in university, so we're talking like 15 years ago, and I'd kind of hung onto them because I didn't know what was the right project for them. So I used these, and because they are really mid-toned, I then had to think about bringing in the light tones and bringing in the dark tones, and it turned out to be perfect because it let me capture so much of the animal in such a short period of time without having to think about colour, because there really wasn't time for colour mixing or relying on line work, which again I'm not my most confident thing. For me, I can get a lot more character and tone than I can get in line. Some people it's the opposite, they can have a really characterful line, but I don't think I do particularly, so for me tone is more characterful for me. So I've got some examples here, and I was kind of struggling with these at the beginning, and then once I started bringing in the white pencil and bringing in the tone, it kind of clicked, and I was like seeing the shape of the animal more, seeing where their weight was, seeing how they were moving. I was capturing their personality more. So yeah, it was this kind of big breakthrough. I think that one was the breakthrough, and putting the white in underneath with the fox, and it just gives it that contrast that really brings it to life. So yeah, I've got some examples. I love that one. I've never drawn a jellyfish before, but I love how that turned out. And I love that otter as well, actually. It's rather lovely. So yeah, I really liked this as a technique, and it got me to think in a completely different way. So I thought it would be really good for all of us to do as an exercise. So I love penguins. We've got a penguin, and this is also our weekly drawing challenge. So yeah, for this challenge you will need toned paper. So you could use something like this kind of manila paper is great. You know, index cards, old files, that kind of thing. Brown craft paper is great. So I have a sketchbook with toned paper. It's by Hannah Mueller. They did send it to me for free. I did work with them and they sent me some goodies. So, and I think this sketchbook is called something like the Cappuccino sketchbook, so I will link to it. But if you don't have a sketchbook with toned paper, you know, it can be anything. It can be brown craft paper. It can be the back of a brown envelope. It doesn't have to be brown either. You could use grey paper or blue paper, whatever you have. Just, if it's not a paper you normally paint on, I would do a little test first, just to make sure that whatever material you use isn't going to kind of bleed or spread or not work in the way that you want. I found when I was painting these that the paint looked quite dark, and then it soaked in and dried and was really light. So for me it was difficult to get really dark tones with the paint because it was soaking in, but the white stood out really nicely, and then I also brought in some pencil as well. So do have a little test out and see how your materials are going to react on the paper. So I've got one here already. I did a little test run. we've got another one here. So I thought this image would be a good one because it is predominantly midtones actually. If we look at it, there's a lot of grey, and then we've got the strong black on the penguin, the strong white on the penguin, there's some reflections on the water, and there's some highlights on the, what are they called? On the rocks. But there's a lot of midtones, so I thought that would be quite a good one to work with, which I might just work on this page, because then we can have the image next to us and you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so sketching first. I'm going to sketch in my this pencil, which is French grey. I love it, you can tell that because it's very tiny now. So I'm just going to sketch this little penguin. I'm trying to make him not too big. As he's the main subject, there is a tendency to make him big because he's you know, main character syndrome, that he's the only thing in the picture that we're going to make him fill the picture and make him really big. At least I would do that naturally, but I think he looks like quite a small penguin. He looks quite young and he's quite small in the scene, so I'm going to try not to make him too big. So I've kind of got him, and then I'm going to put in a bit of the rock and the rock behind. There's so many different tones here. This is going to be a great way of tackling this image. And then we've got a few kind of other rocks in the background. So if I was doing this on white paper, I would have to put so much grey in all the way around to make him stand out, or her stand out. But this way, we've actually, a lot of the work is done for us, and then we can just build on it. So I'm going to start with the white. So I am using, this is a Derwent Pro Colour. I've got two. I've got this one, and then I've also got the Luminance. I don't really know which one I prefer. I think they're both fine. I wouldn't say either was amazing personally. I think they're fine. Maybe I'll just do a quick test swatch and see if either one is coming up a little bit more opaque. Actually, I think this one is more opaque and giving more texture. So I'm going to go for this one, which is the Luminance. Okay, so white first. And you can do this with any material that is white and opaque. So it could be a pencil, it could be a Neocolor pastel, it could be white wash, it could be a white marker pen, you know, like a paint marker. Pastel, pencil, chalk, paint marker, gouache, anything that is white and will stand out on the toned paper. I like this pencil because it is not water soluble, it is permanent, which means I can layer stuff over it quite nicely, and I'll sort of show you that in a minute. So if I want to put tone on the white area, I can lay shadows on top. So I can lay some shadows here, kind of under the belly where there's a little bit of shadow there. But I like using the pencil because I can get texture and I can also get precision as well, and I can make the pencil heavier in some areas, so that's more white, and then there's more of the paper showing through kind of here. And then he's got that little bit on its head. And then I'm just going to do the beak just for contrast, and then looking at the rocks that he's on, And then the feet, I think I'm just going to leave the feet the colour of the paper, so I just need to carefully paint around them. I'm going to put a few highlights in. Which hopefully will add some nice kind of texture to the rocks as well. Putting in some pebbles. We'll see. And then looking at reflections on the water. And kind of littler ripples here, kind of around the penguin, bigger kind of ripples over here, and ripples kind of around the rocks a little bit. Okay, and then going in with the tones, so I think I'm going to go in dark tones for the penguin and then go in kind of mid-tones around for the rocks and the ripples, I think. Let's see. This is the tricky bit, getting the that little beak right. And then the okay, and then going in with more of the mid-tone. So we've obviously got a mid-tone here, but I want to have more kind of subtlety and variation. So I'm going to put in some tone kind of around feet. Just kind of looking at where the shadows are. And you can see the pencil's kind of water resistant, which is quite nice, so then I can work over the top of it. Just trying to define those feet a bit more. And then put some shadows in here. So the white is kind of resisting the shadows, which is quite nice because then you get texture and the shadow is quite subtle. And this wing's more in shadow as well. And I can just put like a few little feathers in. And then I'm going to start putting in some of these reflections just quite loosely. With anything like water, shadows, the thing that kind of kills it is trying to get it really, really accurate and controlled, because reflections, you know, shadows, they're always moving, they're ephemeral, so just keeping them loose and not overworking them is kind of key, I would say. but kind of noticing things like the ripples being smaller where they're meeting the rocks and bigger further out to sea. And just kind of squinting so I can see where the bigger areas of light and dark are. And again, when you're painting anything kind of natural like rocks, I just hold my brush quite loosely so that I'm not making anything too perfect. And then kind of looking at what needs more definition. So kind of more definition around the rocks definitely needed. They've got little claws at the end of their feet, maybe. I don't think doing the feet that way was my best idea ever, but you know, it's just kind of experimenting really and seeing what works, what doesn't. I feel like it needs more definition here on its chest. So I don't know whether to pop some tone in behind or whether it's enough just to put in a bit more white. I don't know. And then just popping in a little eye. Yeah, I think I'm happy with that. I'm going to leave that there. Maybe I need a tiny bit more kind of ripples and water up here, just so we get the sense that these are rocks in the water, not, you know, ominous clouds or something. But yeah, hopefully you can see how you kind of can build up on tonal paper, and it gets you to look at the image in a different way, thinking about the highlights, thinking about the darkest tones. So yeah, this is our weekly challenge, weekly drawing challenge, so you'll have a chance to have a go at capturing this cute little penguin yourself. So I'm really looking forward to see what everybody does. But yeah, so I hope this second video on tone was helpful and it's helped you kind of look at images, identify the tones, make artistic decisions so that the tones work for you. I mean, honestly, most of it just comes down to squinting at your artwork, squinting at your reference image. It really does help you kind of notice those tones, and then suddenly all the shadows and highlights will kind of pop out at you and you'll kind of see what you're working with. But yeah, I hope that was helpful.